forward to this. Voilà, so welcome to this new online talk today on Hello Brussels, talking about the Quartier Léopold. You see that the session has been recorded and you will get the link in the coming days. Thank you so much. And Hélène, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. Welcome, as Blanca said, to the Hello Brussels Quartier Léopold history and a story of development and change. So the Hello Brussels is an initiative of the European School of Administration in collaboration with facilitators from different DGs. It's a series of events that aims at assisting newcomers to Brussels and becoming familiar with Brussels and facilitator integration, but it's also made for people who have been living here for quite some time and who want to challenge their stereotypical view on Brussels or discover known areas in a different way. So in the series of this initiative, we have several webinars, but we also have live guided tours. For the webinars, you can find them on our website, and we have had some previous webinars about the city of Brussels, more in particular, for example, about street art, the Woluwe Valley, and the garden cities of Brussels. Maybe with the holidays approaching, it would be the perfect opportunity to have a look at the recordings and maybe to explore the discussed treasures yourself. For those who are interested in the walk and cycle guided tours, there's a group on Teams where the different activities and guided tours will be announced. We will send the link to join in the chat, and all colleagues are, of course, more than welcome to join. So today we're going to talk about the history and the future of the Quartier Léopold, often referred to as the European Quarter, and our speaker will be Alexandros Kriasis. Just a small word about Alexandros. He has been working at the Commission for more than 20 years and lives in Brussels, or more specifically in Ouderghem, since the end of 2006. He works in DG Environment and he specialized in legislation on chemicals. And in recent years, he has been exploring the 19 communes of the Brussels capital region more in depth, and eventually he became a Brussels greeter in 2018. As a Brussels greeter, he's helping visitors and newcomers to discover Brussels like a local and off the beaten track, and it has become his passion since that day. So I'm very happy to give you the floor, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Hélène, for this nice introduction. And I'm starting to share my screen now, so you should see it in a second. Just to say that I noticed that there is some delay in my video, so it looks a little bit funny. I hope that my bandwidth is going to come back in a second, so that you can also enjoy it. Unfortunately, on the top of the screen, you have these sort of gray fields, which I cannot really hide. That's a specificity of Zoom, but I will do my best to move them to the uppermost corner and whenever possible to move them in another corner when there's a picture in when it's blocking something on the slide. So thank you for the introduction. Just to say that also during the presentation I will not be able to see the chat or the questions that are coming in. Again, that's otherwise it would block the screen here. Again, that's the specificity of Zoom. So that will all be better once we move to WebEx, because then you can share the screen and at the same time follow the chat. So there's also some advantages in changing the system. But please, I would like to invite you to be active in the chat, and also if you have questions, just put them in, share your experience, point out if I'm saying something wrong. That can also happen, of course. Share your opinion with the participants. That will all make it more lively for the other colleagues that are following. And I will we will have a break, sort of halfway through, so that we can address what is in the chat and in the Q&A. And of course, we will have the same at the end of the presentation. Oops, that was the wrong button. So Today's objective is to give you a general idea about the history of the Quartier Léopold, which is officially known as Eastern Extension to the city of Brussels, or in French, Extension Est. But nowadays, as Hélène said, most people simply refer to it as the European Quarter, which is technically not exactly the same thing. But nevertheless, let's not make it too complicated. Normally, it's quite interchangeable whether you call it European Quarter or Quartier Léopold. But you'll see through the presentation these slight differences. I will stick to the name Quartier Léopold because I think that gives it the connection to its historical to its history and how it actually came about. Now, the Quartier Léopold, or the European Quarter, is of course the area in which most of you are working, or you will be working, or maybe you have been working there already. So it's quite significant for everybody in Brussels what the history of this is, why we are here, and what is going to happen. And if you tune in from outside Brussels, of course, it's also a nice story to tell in terms of urban development, and interesting to see also maybe a little bit more maybe of your past or your future workplace if you ever intend to move here. So we are going to cover the story of the Quartier from its beginning to today, and I'm trying also to give you a little bit outlook into the future, and I've divided that into 4 different time phases. But we will spend almost half of the time actually in phase 1, and then after the break we will go through the other phases. So at the end of this presentation you should have a decent idea about the history of the area and why we're actually here where we are. In this case, a small word up front, as usual, I do not like to judge in my presentations. I leave that normally to all you. But here in particular, people have different views on historic developments, and as usual, it's very difficult to say who is right or wrong. So no judgment from my side. It's a matter of personal preferences and perspective, of course. And of course, what I'm going to present you is only my personal take of it. But now relax and enjoy our time travel. We are starting our time travel some 240 years ago, and until the beginning, so roughly at the late 18th century, early 20th century, 19th century, and until the beginning of the 19th century, the city of Brussels entirely grew within the perimeter of the second city walls. Those were erected in the 14th century, so for many hundreds of years it stayed within the perimeter of the city walls. And we know this area today in Brussels as the Pentagon. And you can clearly see that whenever you look on a map of Brussels, you will immediately see in the center the shape of the Pentagon. The surrounding communes that we of course now have in the Brussels capital region, the 90 communes, most of them remained quite small villages or hamlets, but this hundreds of years of developments within the city walls meant that when arriving around 1800, the city of Brussels was stuck in a medieval layout of the city, narrow and dirty streets. Factories and workshops were established amongst the houses. The air was unhealthy, and diseases were spread quite commonly due to the inundations of the river Seine. So in general, that a very typical medieval city in a nutshell, but certainly not a place where anybody would like to stay, and most certainly not the upper classes and the nobility. So further on, so the bastion and the ramparts that surrounded the city, over time they completely lost their purpose for they completely lost their military purposes, and they became in an increasing trouble for the expansion, of course, and the city for the expansion of the city, of course, but also a significant barrier to the economic development. So in 1782, the Emperor Joseph II gave the order to commence with the dismantling of the bastions. And in 1810, this was complemented by an order of Napoleon Bonaparte, who also ordered the destruction of the ramparts, and those were then to be replaced with green urban boulevards in accordance with the Parisian urban model. But these boulevards actually only saw became a reality around 1819. By that time, Brussels had changed ownership again, and was now under Dutch reign. And these boulevards, these, well, quite grand and luxurious boulevards that were replacing the ramparts, were designed by the architect Jean-Baptiste Vivquin, which you see here in the bottom of the slides. And we know these boulevards today as Petit Ceinture, and they are, well, not really luxurious nowadays anymore. But, well, if you look closely, you find some traces of that luxurious past. Well, and then when the city of Brussels became a capital, that was really the point where it became evident that within the perimeters of the city walls, the city was too small, too uncomfortable to accommodate all these new functions of this young state. And yeah, it had to house all the diplomats, businessmen, politicians, the growing bourgeois society, and all these put pressure on the development. And so as the bastions and the ramparts were rapidly disappearing, the upper classes started to move out into the surrounding communes, which offered more spacious and more greener living places, so more suitable for the aristocratic lifestyle. The trouble for the city of Brussels was that this, of course, reduced the tax income within the city, because all the rich people were moving out. And so the idea of creating a new quarter was not only driven by the population, by the population pressures, but also clearly an economic. There was also clearly an economic reason in order to keep the taxes within the city. So in 1835, a person called Ferdinand de Meuse, and of course, you know, if you're living in Brussels, the de Meuse Square, they created, with a few other people, the Civil Society for the Acquisition of Immovable Property. And that was an economic, well, that was a society that started buying up land in what was then the commune of Saint-Josse, not just neighboring the city of Brussels. And then the next, in 1837, the civil society for the enlargement and beautification of Brussels was created. I think that's a wonderful name, the beautification of Brussels. And that society had the very specific vision to create a new quarter, and that new quarter should be named after King Leopold I. So, yeah, land was bought. The society tasked with the development of this quarter was created. Several plans have been made, and eventually the design of the architect Tilman François Seuss was selected. His design referred to the design of the Park of Brussels that already existed at the time. I'm afraid for the quality, I'm sorry, I apologize for the quality of the picture. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a decent quality copy of that. I mean, it's a very old map and it's quite faded in originally already, so you have to bear with that. So the Parc Léopold was created, and as you can see, the planning of the Quartier Léopold, which shows here on the right-hand side, is just prolonging the lines in the Parc de Léopold. And what Tilman François Seuss did, he created here Rue Joseph II as the northern end of the quartier. And then, somewhat in prolongation of this diagonal axis, he created Rue de Tronne as the southern end of the quartier that was to be developed, and as we said, that was to be named after Leopold I. This, what you can see here, is of course not exactly what it was looking like. His plans already also included a number of amenities such as a courthouse, a race course, circuit, a market and barracks, and he even planned a royal palace. So this grand thing that you can see here on the right hand side, because the palace as we know it today, which is today of course located opposite the park, didn't exist at the time in this format. So he already foresaw that of course the new king also needed a proper palace. But as we know, these things have not really materialized. The only thing that eventually was built was the church Saint-Joseph and the Concert Noble ballroom. But with these few alterations, more or less, I mean, the plan already shows what is there today. Then, sorry, I have a mix up with my slide. Here we are. So, sorry, not with the slides, with my notes. So this new quarter, you see it again here on the map. Here is the Park of Brussels, and here we're having the Quartier Léopold, already named here as Quartier Léopold. The new quarter developed very well. In April 47, so approximately 10 years later, there was a report on the financial situation of the city, and it found that the Quartier Léopold was the richest and the most prestigious district of the city of Brussels. Now, around this time, the city of Brussels was also obliged to provide, by 1852, a field of maneuvers for the garrison that was located in the city. And it was finally decided that this would be established at the end of an extended Rue de la Loi. So Rue de la Loi was planned, it's this long stretch here, was planned as part of the Quartier Léopold, and it was then seen that this should be extended further to this maneuver field. And that is, of course, the area that we know today as Parc Saint-Contenaire. So, however, there was a little thing of the Maalbeek Valley that crosses this terrain, and this constituted a major obstacle for the development and for the development of the Quartier Léopold and its expansion, and of course also for the prolongation of Rue de la Loi. So in 1852, it was decided that they would put up a bridge, and they started extensive work which was necessary to dry up the marshes around the Maalbeek Valley and the ponds that were there, and the Maalbeek stream itself would have to be vaulted, and sewers had to be built. And in compensation for all conducting all this work in relation to the field of maneuvers, the city of Brussels was given the right to annex the Quartier Léopold. So the area of the original development here, and also the area that was located north of Rue de la Loi, so this roughly this part of land here. Due to this annexation of these areas, the commune of Saint-Josse lost a whopping 58% of its original territory, and that's why today it is the smallest of the communes that we are having in the Brussels capital region. Etterbeek lost the site of the maneuver field, and there was also a little bit of loss by Schaerbeek along Rue de Neuilly, which is somewhere here in this area. Around the same time of the annexation, there was a zoological and horticultural garden appeared, and I will talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. So I'll directly jump to the next thing. In 1855, there was the arrival of the railway, and you can see this curvy line in the map, which shows the railway line, and that's basically the railway that is also still there today. This resulted, of course, into, well, not of course, but this resulted into the development or into the creation of a railway station for the Quartier Léopold, which was later then called the station Luxembourg. And then around 1876, well, basically less than 20 years after its creation, the maneuver field was moved again. Then it would become an exhibition field, and finally the Parc Saint-Contenaire as we know it today. And at the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Brussels, they started building the Triumph Arch. That in itself is a very long story, very interesting, but I will keep that for another presentation. Now, I was mentioning a zoo that was created, and many of you will probably ask, well, where is the zoo in the European quarter? So along the Maalbeek, on the western slope, to be precise, there was an area which covered the current Parc Léopold, the area around Place Jourdain and Chaussée de Wavre. And in this area, the lords of the city of Brussels owned a large estate, which was called Eggewoord. By the way, I'm certainly not pronouncing all these French and Dutch names properly, but I'll do my best. So we don't really know why and where that estate originates from, but by the end of the Middle Ages, it was a very substantial fiefdom. It had castles, mills, ponds, meadows, agricultural land, and even breweries on it. So it was quite a large domain. At the start of the 18th century, so around 1700, this this estate was split up, and we are in particular interested now for our story in the northern part of that state, which eventually ended up under the ownership of Dubois de Bianco family. So they owned this property around 1800. And now coming finally to the story of the zoo, in 1851, the Royal Society of Zoology, Horticulture and Pleasure was created. And the Dubois de Bianco family made this territory available for this society in exchange for shares to that society. And so there would be for around 25 years in this area, or that would be an area with country festivals, concerts taking place in an English garden. There was an ice ring, exotic animals, horticultural greenhouses, and all sorts of other curiosities that were presented there. The star of the zoo was without any doubt an elephant lady called Betsy. I found a picture of that elephant, as you can see, and she was born wild and brought to Brussels in 1851 in order to populate the zoo. And there was a newspaper article on Betsy and in L'Histoire, and they wrote, Betsy was among the most popular and sympathetic figures. She enjoyed a privileged position in the zoological garden, as she was allowed to walk in the gardens at certain times of the day, and she was the joy of the visitor children's. So she was really the main attraction in the park. But sadly, the reality wasn't always as joyous. While zoological gardens in principle were all the rage at the time, I mean, there were zoos in many cities across Europe popping up. In the one in Brussels lacked scientific backup and sufficiently trained staff, and unfortunately, very quickly, the animals started to die because of this lack of care and malnutrition, or even of hunger. Some of the animals were eventually used to feed other animals, and it seems, unfortunately, that also Betsy died in Brussels, but I wasn't able to find anything on the circumstances. So whether she was died or whether she was one of the animals that were eventually sold to other owners, I don't know. So the zoological garden eventually declared bankruptcy in 1877. To the contrary, the horticultural part, which was led by the botanist Jean-Jules Linden, this part was managed quite well, and aware that the zoological part wasn't doing so well, Linden bought the part of the country on which the horticultural facilities were located, so that he would not be affected by the bankruptcy of the zoo. In this, well, as I said, there were greenhouses, and he cultivated, in particular, rare plants, in particular orchids and dwarf palm trees that were very popular, and they sold very successfully. So the zoo went bankrupt. There was an attempt to revive it, but it didn't manage. It didn't work out. And yeah, the animals were, as I said, eventually slaughtered or sold to in individuals or menageries. the eastern part of the ground was falling to the state, and the western part was falling to the city of Brussels. And eventually the area was called Quartier Léopold in 1880, after it fell to the state, at the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Kingdom of Belgium. And this time it was named again after King Leopold, but this time it was Leopold II. Now, the zoo may have disappeared as such, but the history of it continues still today. If you will see numerous references. For example, you may have seen the ostrich sculptures in the garden next to the parliament. There's also a new playground in Quartier Léopold, which makes references to the penguins that were in the park. But if you look closer, you can see all sorts of elements depicted on the various signs in the park. So all this makes reference to the history that there was a park. And finally, also the former entrance gates, which are still visible today on the exit of the park towards Rubeya. After the territory of Quartier Léopold fell to the state used the former convent on the ground to house its natural history collection. And well, you can say somewhat that is continuing the tradition of the zoological garden. And of course, well, most of you will probably know that this museum is still there and has been expanded until today. There was a meeting that took place in 1884 between the industrialist Ernest Solvay and the Dr. Paul Eger. That was quite important for the history of the park. Paul Eger was a professor at the University of Brussels, the Université Libre de Bruxelles, so the ULB. And the ULB wanted to expand its medical and scientific faculties, and they were looking for space. And with the horticultural and the natural science institutes already in place in the park, the university institutes followed quite quickly. So between 1892 and 1904, a number of institutes were established: the Institute for Physiology, the Institute for Hygiene, and the Institute for Bacteriology. And that made the park turning very quickly into a scientific hotspot. Later, there was also an addition of a business school and the School for Sociological Studies, as well as the Institut Pasteur that eventually established themselves. Now, this involvement of Ernest Solvay and the university in this park resulted into another quite important thing, and that was the so-called, Solvay conferences. The first one took place in 1911. By invitation of the International Solvay Institute for Physics and Chemistry, which was one of the institutes that was eventually located in the park, and you see it here in the middle of in the center picture. So what's so special about these Solvay conferences? They still go on today, actually, and they gather really the top scientists, the top physicians, and the top chemists of the times. And so it's really a high-level group of meeting, which of course influence very significantly the scientific world, well, in particular, on physics and chemistry. And so the 1911 Solvay conference was really seen as a turning point in physics, and provided a lot of stimulus, and the Solvay conferences still do so today. So if you take a closer look at the picture on the bottom left, for example, you will see here the only lady in the picture is, of course, Marie Curie, who is talking here, well, pretending to talk probably for the picture, with Monsieur Ernest Solvay. And just to mention one more name here on the right of the picture, you find, of course, young Albert Einstein. So and of course, if you're a little bit familiar, but I don't want to bother you with all the names of the participants, quite really a lot of famous names here in that, and a lot of Nobel Prize laureates are represented, or later Nobel Prize laureates are represented here in this picture. So in 1913, also this area was annexed to the city of Brussels. But eventually, well, not but, and eventually in 1921, the ULB, so the university, decided to move to the Solbosch site, where it is still today. But that was not the end of the science park as such, although it was the beginning of the end of the science park. Other institutions followed, such as the Lycée Jacquemin and the Dental Institute George Eastman, that took over the buildings. So there were two quite important periods in the history of the Quartier Léopold, so the Zoological and Horticultural Society, and then the era as a science park. And of course, from this area are all these wonderful buildings that we still see today in the science park. The building on the bottom right, if you're wondering, is no longer standing. That was replaced by the Institute Georges Eastman, which is now the European House of History. So apart from the park, what did the Quartier Léopold actually look like? Here are a few pictures from around 1900. So we're first looking here at the area around Place Luxembourg. Well, you can see the station building is still there today, but the surrounding buildings are, of course, meanwhile gone. And behind the train station, you see here a chimney and some houses in the background, was actually the Brasserie Léopold. There's a picture here on the bottom right, which was located there since the 1860s. And so that covered quite a lot of ground there. Business became a little bit more difficult for this brewery after the Second World War. It was eventually sold to Heineken, and for the beer fans amongst you, eventually in 1976, it became part of the Artois group, and it eventually ceased its activities in 1981. So there was quite a lot of industrial, wasteland at the end, and that land would later be used to build the European Parliament buildings. Next, let's have a look at what Rue de la Loi and the surroundings of Rue de la Loi looked like around this time. We're talking around 1900, 1910. On the picture to the left, we see the bridge, Rue de la Loi, up here on top, the bridge that goes over the Maalbeek Valley that I mentioned earlier. Now, here you can already see the river was already vaulted, so nothing left from the river. And instead, we are having here Rue d'Etterbeek, as we know it today. I'm not quite sure from which direction this picture is taken, but I think today we find here on the left side the one building, and on the right-hand side the Lex building. But I'm not 100% sure it may also be the other way around. But just to give you an orientation where this picture was taken. And on the right-hand side, we see what the Schumann roundabout looked like around the time, and the view towards the Triumph Arch, which was by that time almost finished. It's not yet as it is today, but it's almost there. Now, as the original parameter of the Quartier Léopold was eventually fully built up by 1864. During the 1870s, there was a gradual expansion towards the countryside north of Rue de la Loire, which was which was also part of the area which was annexed by to the city of Brussels. What is noteworthy is that this was at the time merely seen as an extension of the existing Quartier Léopold, and that you can also see here on the map. You vaguely can still read the name Quartier Léopold. And but of course, nowadays we know this area better as the Quartier des Squares. Again, there were a number of plans that were developed, that were proposed to develop this area, and eventually in 1874, the city nominated Gédéon Bordiot as the chief architect for the development of this area. An important factor that influenced this development was the decision in 1875 that instead of going overground, the railway line that we saw in the earlier map was to be buried underground, so that there could be an urban continuity without an interruption of a railway line. And the final plan allowed the railway line to be buried both under Boulevard de Charlemagne, that's what we on this side here, and on Boulevard Clovis on the other side. And you still see still today you see the curvy shape of this road, which is hiding the railway that nowadays, well, as of then, went underground. So that's the only curvy line in this area. Otherwise, it's mostly a triangular approach that was chosen, except for this well, interruption by the railway, if you want to say so. So after the delay due to the works on the railway, the first houses sprung up in the 1880s, but it was initially a relatively slow development. However, between 1890 and 1900, there was a massive construction wave. And already by 1910, the area was completely built up. And there were very few changes until the 1950s. However, one important element that you may be wondering when you're looking here at this, that you may be wondering about when looking at this map is, of course, the church here in the background on Square Marguerite. That was eventually never built. It would have, of course, been a very nice focal point for the view across the square, and it would certainly have added some glamour to the Square Marguerite, because the Square Marguerite, if you look at it still today, it lacks a little bit of flair compared to the grandeur of the other three squares, Ambiorix, Palmerston, and Marie-Louise down here. That's the reason why Square Marguerite was never as prestigious and never as developed as the other squares. The church was eventually built in a side street, and the point was simply the people couldn't agree on a design for the church, so it was eventually never built on this at this point. So what did this area look like? A bit more zooming in. First of all, as we said, it was a very short period of 20 years during which most houses were built in this area. And that means that from an architectural perspective, these squares show a very homogeneous character. And that has been preserved mostly until today, with a few exceptions. So in the picture to the left, you see the northern side of the square Ambiorix. Those buildings are still, most of them are still there today. And if you look closely, you can identify here maybe the building, the Saint-Cyr building. That is maybe something you may be familiar with. Also on the top right, Rue Franklin still has mostly the old building stock. Well, the corner buildings have gone. This is here now well, this is now a pharmacy, as you may know, but the buildings in the background are mostly still there. What has clearly changed is the area that is shown here in the bottom right corner, which is the corner of Rue de la Loire with Boulevard Charlemagne. That is, of course, now the location where we find the Charlemagne building. So this bit here has, of course, completely gone. And now I gave you a quick run through the initial development phase of the Quartier, and that has been quite a number of dates and names. I think it's time to give your brains a little bit of a break, and maybe it's time to have a look at what was happening in the chat and whether you have any questions before we continue with the story of the area until to now.
I think for the moment we don't have any questions. So if there are colleagues who want to ask something about the first part, feel free to, or just a little comment in the chat, because for the moment there hasn't been a lot of interaction, but feel free to add something. And otherwise you can go on and then we'll have the questions after. Yeah, okay.
I'll keep an eye, because what I can see are the figures. So if something pops up, I can make another break, short break later on, since we're now saving a little bit of time. So yeah. So in the second phase of these phases are something that I invented in terms of breaking down the story a little bit here. It's not official phases. But in the second phase, we will look what happened in the Quartier Léopold between 1910 and 1950, so roughly around the two world wars. This is a period after the area was fully developed, but before the European institution arrived in the area. So the Quartier Léopold reached its population peak in 1900. Then it had 6,323 residents were registered in the area. At that moment in time, it was almost exclusively a residential district, but change was already on the horizon. Most of the houses from the first development phase, so the original Quartier Léopold, had been lived in for a good 50 years, and they started to age. They were no longer up to date. Meanwhile, there was technological developments and new amenities such as electricity, central heating, and new hygienic standards came along. So it was really necessary to update those houses. However, in the meantime, there were greener areas that were developed, areas further out, such as the areas along Avenue Louise, Bois de la Cambre, and Avenue de Tervuren, that were then, by that time, actually more attractive to the upper classes. And in parallel, there was also the development of new means of transport. There was railway, there were trams, the cars started to coming in. So proximity to the city was no longer as important as it used to be before. So instead of updating the outdated houses, quite a number of inhabitants turned their back to the Quartier Léopold and moved further out. So that was one of the drivers of the change, but actually it was the First World War that was the real game changer here. Because also in terms of general history, the First World War came around the time of the First World War. There was already a looming change for the way of life and society as a whole. The workers' and women's rights movements were on the rise. And when the men were sent into the war, the women quickly realized that they could take up their positions, and that was far more attractive than enduring the brutal working conditions and the very low salaries that they got in the domestic service sector. And that also meant that there was a massive increase of demand for servants, which drove the prices up. And eventually, except for the very rich parts of the society, after the First World War, it became almost impossible to keep that array of servants that they had before. So, but all the bourgeois houses in the Quartier Léopold, and also a little bit the houses that were built a little bit later, were constructed around the availability of servants. So after the First World War, many households realized that the traditional house wasn't very practical without or with fewer servants. And so who would take care of the fire, of the heating, who would carry all the coals, the woods for the heating, and who would be prepared in dark and dingy basement kitchens. So there was a real problem here, and one of the ways out was that the bourgeois society discovered the apartment as a fashionable form of living. Until that point in time, apartment buildings, they were existing, but they didn't really flourish. And while these apartments remained very sizable, sometimes hundreds of square meters, running a household in an apartment building was significantly cheaper and required significantly less servants. However, the quartier was fully built up, so there was no space for apartment buildings. So there was, but the area nevertheless remained prestigious for the time being. And so developers started to knock down all the outdated, old-fashioned buildings and replace them by large apartment buildings. So you can still see quite a number of those in the dotted around the quartier. Amongst others, the ultra luxurious residence palace, which is also still largely intact today, sprung up. So that's the building that we see on the left picture, and then also on the right-hand side, the towers built by the architect Jean-Jules Eggerix on Square de Meuse. They eventually paved the way for the high-rise building, and many of you may not believe it, but they're actually pre-Second World War. Most people think they are from the 50s or 60s, but they actually were so advanced in their thinking, so they're really from the 1930s. So zooming in a little bit closer, what was it like in the Quartier Léopold? Although it was changing, the quartier still had its strategic location close to the government. The people living there still had a lot of connections, not only to the government, but also there were businessmen, political circles. So As a consequence of that, the Quartier Léopold gradually attracted ministers, ministries, companies, and embassy. For example, the Ministry of Economic Affairs had a number of buildings alongside Rue de la Loi and Rue Jacques Delalande. And a lot of European countries established their embassies there. For example, the German one was on Rue Bayard, where we now find the Goethe Institute, and the embassy of the United States resided on Rue de la Science in the former palace, or in the palace that formerly belonged to the Marquis de H, and that now houses the Belgian Council of State. So still a very large building. So together with the appearance of the apartment buildings that I was mentioning, more and more houses were knocked down or turned into office buildings, and were benefiting from the prestigious reputation that the area still had. However, I think one figure shows the development. By 1930, already 30% of the inhabitants had already left the quarter. Now I see that there are a number of reactions in the chat, and the question there's one more slide before we can make before we finish this phase, and then I will make another break for to address what is happening in the chat. So we were saying that in the 30s already there was an exodus starting from the Quartier Léopold, and these pictures here from the 1950s and 60s show you the degree of change that is happening, what that was happening after the Second World War, when the fate of the residential nature of the Quartier Léopold was eventually sealed. It were mainly insurance companies that discovered real estate as a speculation object, and it was a lucrative way to make money. And why, particularly in the Quartier Léopold? Because it had this orthogonal layout. The distribution of the blocks and this layout made it very easy to merge building plots and for the development of larger buildings. So more and more of the old mansions were knocked down, and they were then replaced by larger office buildings, which at the time normally had 4 to 6 floors. And in successive waves in 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the neighborhood was eventually transformed into the office district. So we see here clearly on the left picture, Avenue des Arts, what was initially a prestigious boulevard. You can see it already from the houses had already changed. It's no longer the flair of a luxurious boulevard or of a residential area. And the same is true for Rue d'Arlon, and on the right picture, Rue Bayard. I mean, Rue Bayard almost looks, on that picture, almost like it still looks today, full of houses, well, the one or the other apartment house between, but mostly office buildings. What is noteworthy, though, is that the story of the Quartier des Squares was quite different. You may remember this was the area that was developed after the initial Quartier Léopold, so more around 1900. So after the Second World War, also the houses in the Quartier des Squares started to age, but it was much easier to adapt them to the modern living comforts compared to the neoclassical houses that we had in the initial Quartier Léopold. And that is one of the reasons why in the Quartier des Squares we still see today that it is largely intact, and why it is still predominantly predominantly residential still today. So in the Quartier des Squares, this exodus of the original inhabitants that happened in the Quartier Léopold didn't take place to the same degree in the Quartier des Squares. Nevertheless, also the Quartier des Squares suffered, in particular in the areas that are closer to Rue de la Loi. And I think it's not without some irony or fate that it was actually also the influx of the European officials that started around that time that saved or that contributed to saving the Quartier des Squares from the same fate as the Quartier Léopold, because not few officials bought these attractive houses in the vicinity of their work space, and thereby saving them from being demolished or turned into offices. However, we're jumping a little bit ahead, and let's see what happened in the next phase. But before we go there, Hélène, maybe we can take the opportunity to have a look at the chat and the questions.
Yes, there are 2 questions. Mm-hmm. The first one is, knowing the previous history of the Residence Palace, precisely during the Second World War, could you say what has become the Residence Palace today? Is it the private occupancy, apartments, offices, or is it a mix of both?
Yeah, Residence Palace is a very interesting and long history, so I'll keep the answer short. It's really worthwhile looking into it. It's a super interesting building, and if you ever have the opportunity to visit it, it's amazing. Well, you will know, I mean, the Residence Palace has a number of wings, and they now have different purposes. So one wing is now connected to the Europa building, so it's now part of the European Council building. Then there is a wing that is occupied by journalist representation. So a lot of media houses have their representation there. One wing has recently been returned as an apartment wing. So today there's quite a mix of things happening in the Residence Palace.
Okay. And for the second question, there's someone asking where the Avenue des Arts is located. Mm-hmm. If there's by any chance a well-known site or building today, so that the person could situate where it is.
Yeah, no problem. I know that I'm sort of giving you all the name, assuming that, of course, you know all this, but it's so Avenue des Arts is well, let's maybe start here in the background where you vaguely see the tram. This is where Rue de la Loi is crossing. So this is the Avenue des Arts is part of the Petit Ceinture, where we now have these big streets where you have all the tunnels undergoing the crossing. Here, the 2 high-rise buildings in the background, this is where we would find the tower, the Madou Tower, which is also occupied by the Commission. Here on the left-hand side, somewhere, I'm not quite sure exactly where, is the Embassy of the United States. And then furthermore to the left, outside the picture, you would have the Brussels Park. So it's Avenue des Arts is between Brussels Park and the Quartier Léopold. Yeah, let me quit the. Let me change that quickly so that we can see this map here. So here, this is the parameter of the original city walls. Here we're having the Parc de Bruxelles, Parc Saint-Contenaire, Parc Léopold, and here is the original Quartier Léopold. And here on top, we have the Quartier des Squares. And Avenue des Arts is here this stretch. And on the corner of Avenue Rue de la Loire and Avenue des Arts, we have the metro station Arloire. So because it's Rue de la Loire and Avenue des Arts, which are crossing here. So that hopefully gives you a good orientation on where we are.
Okay, great. I think there's one more questions. Someone is saying that in the resident palace, they did a visit and made a tour of the great residence. As in the private sector, I had the chance to organize some professional events. So, and also Blanca said there's a very nice restaurant there.
Indeed, there's a restaurant. I've never been to the restaurant, but it looks very nice. In principle, because there is a restaurant, you can actually enter the entrance hall. So that is normally sort of open, and that the entrance hall in itself is already quite impressive. And if you dare to sneak into where the wardrobes are, a little bit further back, then you will also see some very fascinating stained glass windows. But it's really, it's a luxury complex. There is a swimming pool. There were tennis courts on the roof, all sorts of shops distributed. I mean, a lot of that has disappeared, but for example, the swimming pool is still there. So really an interesting building.
Okay. Thank you. And a theater as well, someone is saying. So a lot to do in that building. So I think that was the last question. So if you want to continue. Please.
Okay, so let's continue with the third phase. So the developments in the Quartier Léopold in this next phase were the result of a decision that was taken quite far away. And initially it didn't even seem to affect the quarter, but as we will find out, there have been a few twists of fate. So this is a period during which the European institutions arrived and transformed the area once again. So it was a very, very long road. So bear with me. There's a little bit of text to say. So in 1951, we see the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community, and immediately there was the question, where are we going to house the institutions? Everybody wanted them. Of course, it was very prestigious. So this question was very controversial right from the start. And well, in principle, it's still on today. So there was only one decision that was taken quickly, and that was that the assembly should be in Strasbourg. The reason is quite simple, because Strasbourg was the only city that had a corresponding assembly hall, because there was already the assembly hall of the Council of Europe. And so the assembly, it was simply the only place where the assembly could go. But then the high authority and the Court of Justice were still left over, and they were temporarily placed in Luxembourg. There were two candidates from Italy, Turin and Milan. They were quickly ruled out because they were considered not central enough. And also a location in Germany wasn't considered appropriate, considering the post-war context. At that time, Brussels wasn't even a candidate city. The Belgian government actually favored Liège, given that it was located in a coal and steel area. But there were some internal struggles here in Belgium related to the abduction of King Leopold III. And so the Belgians didn't really defend that space. And the remaining candidates were The Hague, Luxembourg, and Strasbourg, and Saarbrücken. Now, Saarbrücken may surprise you, because I said a seat in Germany wasn't possible. But Saarbrücken was at the time, well, it's still today, the capital of the Saarland. But at the time, this was an area of Germany that had become a protectorate under French control after the Second World War. And first, the idea was to annex that to France, but with the Schuman Declaration and with the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, the political climate changed, and then the idea developed to turn the area into, or to internationalize the area and to turn it into some kind of European district. And in light of that, the European Coal and Steel Community decided to take that they will have their seats in Saarbrücken once it was turned into a European district. However, in 1955, there was a referendum in the population, and they rejected with this idea with a large majority. So it eventually never materialized that the community moved to Saarbrücken. So and that referendum meant that the search for a seat was back on square one. In 1956, the start of the intergovernmental negotiations on the creation of the European Economic Community and of Euratom started, and those negotiations took place in the chateau of Val-Duchesse in Oregem, not far from where I'm actually now sitting right at the moment, because I also live in Oregem. Yeah, not quite Brussels, but close enough to Brussels. So these negotiations, I mean, yes, we all know, resulted into the Treaty of Rome. And then the first meeting of the Commission and the Council took place in Val-Duchesse in 1958. For the Commission, it was that it should alternately meet in Val-Duchesse and in Luxembourg, in the temporary seat of the European Coal and Steel Community. And the presidency would rotate, as it was the case for a long time, in the countries. But because Belgium was first in the alphabet, they also had the first, they also hosted the first council meeting. So in 1958 was eventually the arrival of the institutions in Brussels. And because the member states couldn't agree, but they assumed that it would take at least 2 years after a decision is finally taken to move and to establish the institutions in whatever place it will be. So they permanent, for the time being, they were left in Brussels, pending a report on of an expert group on the appropriate choice. So that expert group started working, and in the meanwhile, the Belgian government offered to make office buildings available until the final seat was decided. The first building was at Rue de Joyeuse Entrée, just outside the Parc Saint-Contenaire. That building doesn't exist anymore. It's now replaced by the building where the External Action Service is, and where EPSO used to be. I'm not sure, have they moved already to, probably, I think you've moved already to the one. That building was not ready, so the institutions started to spread out in a number of different buildings. Meanwhile, the committee of experts concluded that actually Brussels would be the best candidate. It was actually the only candidate that fulfilled all the criteria. For example, they said it was centrally located, it had excellent traffic connections, it was in a neutral and a small country, so it was not in Germany or in France. It had a metropolitan flair for the officials. And well, one thing almost unimaginable today, the committee concluded that the streets of Brussels were not congested. Things have changed. And the final thing was that here in Brussels, the population was quite in favor of welcoming the institutions, which was not the case in Luxembourg, for example. Well, despite all this despite this report, the member states were still not able to find a compromise, and in 1959 there was a 3-year moratorium put on the search. And well, no surprise, after that period there was still no agreement, but time started playing in favor of Brussels. The government began with the building of the Berlaymont a big complex to end the fragmentation across the area. And as it was becoming clear that at least the Commission would be staying for quite some time in the area in Brussels. By that time, Brussels had become the center of gravity for the European institutions, and Luxembourg reacted to that by following the policy of Belgium, and also Luxembourg started to make policy by building, and they developed the Kirchberg Plateau area. So that was the reaction to this, in order to give more impetus on having to give more weight to the decision in favor of Luxembourg. Well, it took eventually until 1965 until there was a decision on the provisional seats of the institutions, and it was the usual truly European compromise. Council would go to Brussels, except for meetings in April, June, and October, where they would meet in Luxembourg. The Commission remained in Brussels, but some of its administrative services would have to move to Luxembourg. Luxembourg remained the seat of the Court of Justice. Strasbourg remained the seat of the Assembly. But the General Secretariat of the Assembly or the Parliament would have to move to Luxembourg. So that was the situation that we had for a very, very long time. But of course, it did not put an end to the decision, as those were only provisional ones. In particular, the Parliament wasn't really happy with that. And we all know eventually in 1985, it was the Parliament opened a seat in Brussels. So almost 30 years later, it was eventually the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1992 that approved this distribution. So then it became, it lost the provisional status, but it became the de facto reality. And then there was one more decision that was of relevance here, the decision in 2002 to decide that the European councils would take place only in Brussels and no longer with the rotating presidency, in the country of the rotating presidency. So since 2004, almost all councils, with a few exceptions, have taken place here in Brussels. And that was the moment when the people started to talk about Brussels as the capital of as the capital of Europe. So basically, only since the 2000s, that status, or that of course officially doesn't exist, has been attributed to the city of Brussels. Now, so as we saw, the decision for the Quartier Léopold wasn't at all evident. It was more driven by the fact that by chance there was a large enough office building available, and also other office buildings in the area were available. And I think that tells us already a lot about the state the Quartier was in at the time. So, and it had changed very much from its original residential area. So by the time it arrived, it was already quite largely an office area. But of course, the arrival of the institutions accelerated this process even further. I already mentioned that there was a first wave of demolitions in the 1950s. We saw the pictures earlier, but when the European institutions arrived, there was indeed a second wave of demolition beginning. all these developments were done with very little urban planning and based on speculation, as most of us know, and they resulted into the European quarter as we knew it until a few years ago. So this indiscriminate and careless introduction of high-rise buildings into residential areas eventually was called Brusselisation, and that has since become a byword for the absence of urban planning and haphazard development. The term wasn't actually first given to the European quarter. It was more coming up as a result of the city of Brussels preparing itself for the Expo in 1958, the one that also saw the construction of the atomium. So in that context, buildings were torn down without regard to their architectural or historical importance, and instead offices were built, apartments built, boulevards were created, tunnels were dug. So there was a lot of turmoil going on in the city for the 58 exhibition. And yeah, the institutions only just arrived in 58, as we saw in the history, on the slide that I showed earlier. So among the most controversial of these developments was the demolition of townhouses to create the high-rise business district that we see around the North Station, around Gare du Nord. And another very controversial decision was the demolition of a house built by Victor Horta, which was the Maison de Peuple in the Marolles area. And that's something that is very clearly still grieved over today. So Brusselisation remains a very emotional topic here in Brussels. It has left many scars in the landscape. And it was certainly, although it was not caused by the European institutions, the establishment of the European institutions certainly contributed to it. However, I think it's something that's often forgotten in this discussion. It also has to be said that within 20 years, within the space of 20 years, Brussels changed quite radically from being a quite modest national capital to an international political and economic center. So, and the development of an easily accessible administrative park, so namely office buildings, was clearly a driving force behind this development that resulted into the reinvention of the city. Now, yeah, I mean, the difficult question is always, was it worth it? But that's, I think, in the end, something that everybody has to decide individually. What I would like to say is still, and that if you look actually a little bit closer at the Quartier Léopold, it actually still has quite a diverse array of architecture representing the 200 years of its historic development. So, let's come back to the overall development in the quarter and yeah, try a little bit to look at what happened more recently and what is going to happen. It was actually not before 1995, when the Brussels Capital Region was created, that a thinking process started on a more coordinated development in the European quarter or in the Quartier Léopold. It also has to be said, in all fairness, that the absence of the urban planning was not exclusively the fault of the local authorities. The uncertainty about the final seat of the institutions didn't make the town planning really easy and predictable. And that changed only with the introduction of with the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1992. And then, as said, as of sort of 1995, a more thorough planning development started. So the Regional Development Plan of 1995 aimed to put an end to this ever increasing amount of office and commercial space in the quarter. However, at the same time, it was foreseeable that the European Union would expand quite rapidly. The fall of the Iron Curtain and the upcoming enlargement of the European Union in 2004 made it clear that there was added pressure. The institutions had to grow even further, and it became evident that the Quartier Léopold had to be densified if we wanted to address all these needs at once. So that started a long and intense discussion. Just to name, I'm just really going quickly here through some of those developments. So in 2000, there was a task force created, Brussels Europe. That resulted then in 2002 in an Ombudsplan, Brûleur Médiateur. And that plan made more than 100 proposals how to improve the institutions. And one of the key effects was that this plan was the first to define that the Maalbeek Valley, so the area along Rue de Tabec, should be reserved for housing, whereas Rue de la Loire should be reserved predominantly or was destined to office buildings. The plan also already included the reconversion of the Eggerix towers that we saw a little bit earlier on the picture. The towers that are next to Square de Meuse, they had meanwhile become offices, and so the plan foresaw turning them back into apartments. Then there was a trilateral agreement between the state, the region, and the city of Brussels, recognizing that there needs to be more housing. And in 2008, we eventually had the master plan for the European quarter, and that defined 5 strategic objectives. So first of all, it was to create a sustainable development in the area. It should enhance the mobility in the area, strengthen the multifunctional character of the quarter, so not only offices, but also services, other occupations such as housing. The urban quality should be improved, and there should be a strengthening of the cultural and recreational potential in the area. So these were the 5 objectives drawn up by the master plan. One of the proposals was to double the building surface along the Rue de la Loire. This eventually resulted into the 2011 vision by Christian de Port-Saint-Parc, who won the corresponding competition. That resulted into the urban planning for Rue de la Loire, basically saying, okay, we build higher houses, but then in order to compensate for the space loss along the street, yeah, the houses could be higher. So that was the price for allowing more space, creating squares and making more space available to the pedestrians. At the same time, the traffic would be reduced to 1 lane in each direction. And then the different structure and distribution of the houses would allow to bring in light and airflow into the area. So this concept, of course, responded to the brief of the master plan, but it didn't turn out to be very popular because the trouble was that, or one of the big troubles was that the vista through the Cinquantenaire Park would be disturbed. One would no longer see, as it is today, no, there's today in principle, well, up until recently, there was no house that was disturbing the vista. So that was one of the big issues. The other issue was, of course, the concern what is going to happen with the traffic if Rue de la Loire is reduced so drastically in size. So there were quite some concerns about that. However, embedded in this plan, the Commission proposed in 2019 the results of an architectural competition to identify the best solution for its aging office space. You may remember the famous Loire 130 project. Well, it received the same lukewarm reaction, and the first embodiment of this master plan idea, the one tower which is now occupied by the Commission, didn't really help to calm down the controversy, because indeed it interrupted the vista, on top of that, the urban planning on which the building permit for the tower was based was declared void by a court because the region didn't do the necessary environmental impact assessment. So that all didn't really help. Well, we all know what happened next. There was this microscopic life form that came along and made all these plans redundant. There is, of course, our new reality, as we call it, and consequently, with the change of the office structure in the European Commission and the European, predominantly in the European Commission, there will also be a new reality in the European Quarter. So that plan is probably not going to materialize. The urban plan is currently under revision, and I think in particular for Rue de la Loire, it's not going to, and it's going to be completely revised. So with this new reality, what can we say about the future of the quarter? It's very difficult to predict anything. The master plan is under revision. The plan for the Loire 130 has already been abolished, so that's certainly not going to happen. What we can say is the positive trend. The number of people living in the area is increasing again. We see that there is a new bourgeois society moving into the area, and also the new Schumann Square project is, for the time being at least, still ongoing. So Schumann is probably going to look somewhat like we're seeing here on the picture. So Rue de la Loire is probably not going to get all these high-rise buildings, but beyond that, it's very difficult to say anything about the future of the quartier. So with that, I would like to end our time travel through the Quartier Léopold. So we've seen what has triggered the original development of the Quartier Léopold. Here, this orthogonal layout that we mark here on the map in red. It became a prestigious residential area. Later, Rue de la Loire. Oops, where's my mouse? There it is. Later, Rue de la Loire, here this stretch of road was prolonged to what we know is Quartier Saint-Contenaire, crossing the Malbec Valley, allowing for the development of more houses along the Malbec Valley, and then eventually the Quartier des Squares was created. After the Second World War, the European institutions accelerated the already ongoing transition into a business quarter. And but in the more recent times, more thought is going into the urban planning, and more attention is being paid more attention is given to make sure that the area remains a multi-purpose area and does not and loses a little bit in future this massive office business area that it is at the moment. So if you want to dive further into this topic, here are some links which we will of course also share together with the recording and the presentation on EULearn, and of the registered participants will get that also via email. If you really want to dig in it, I can highly recommend the book of Thierry Demey, Brussels, Capital of Europe. It's available in French, Dutch, and in English. So that's really a rich source of information around the quartier and the development of Brussels to what it is now. But yeah, apologies a little bit. I've taken a little bit more than of your time, but yeah, if you have any questions or if something has been going on, I see there were some remarks in the chat. This is now your time again, and I hope we can still have 1 or 2 minutes for.
Yeah, I think we could still have. There's 2 questions in the Q&A. They're very small. But first of all, thank you so much for this interesting presentation. I think everyone learned a lot, and there's a lot of secrets in our quarter, let's say. One of the questions was, what happened to the tunnel connecting the Berlaymont building and the Commission building on Kortenberg? I don't know if you know the answer.
This whole Loi 130 project is cancelled, so it's not going to be built because basically the new reality shows us we are teleworking, we are moving into dynamic workspaces, so we will need a significantly less square footage. So there is no need for these high-rise buildings anymore. But what is going to replace it? What is going to replace that plan? Because we still need new buildings, but yeah, what exactly is going to come is at least not public at the moment. So I don't know anything.
Okay. And another question was, I've heard that at the very beginning, before having a building, the first EU fonctionnaires were located at Rue des Colonies downtown. Is that correct?
Well, the first fonctionnaires were actually if you look at the very beginning, they were located in a house next to Val Duchesse. And then they moved into a building in Rue Bayard, which was later the seat of the Euratom. And then they moved into the building at Joyeuses Entrées that I mentioned. But then there were also a number of other buildings. So maybe there was one on Rue de Colonies. I don't know, but it's very well possible because there were, I think, 11 or 14 buildings in total at the time.
Okay, great. So I think that was it for the questions. In the chat, there are some comments thanking you for this presentation. And if I'm not mistaken, there will be a guided tour in December and one in January. But all the information is on the Teams group. Yeah, and these walks are also already on EULearn. They will more or less complement this presentation. There's one on the where I will show you the Quartier des Squares, but offsite the squares. There's one that where I want to show you the development of the Quartier Léopold on the basis of its architecture. So this is sort of somewhat complementing to what I've been doing today. Okay, great. I think this is the end of our conference. Thank you again. There's one last comment here in the chat. There's a very interesting presentation. Many thanks. I learned a lot about my own city and the area where I grew up and started to work. And happy the conference is recorded. So yeah, that's the end of our conference. Thank you so much, Alexandros, for your time and for this presentation. And Blanca, you can close the session.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks to Alexandros and also the colleagues that are listening. I see we have our dear colleague from Vietnam. So Camille, thank you so much for the nice feedback. Congratulations, Alexandros, for all the positive comments that you always get after your presentations. As Elaine was saying we will send you the link to the recording and hope to see you soon. So we'll put the link also to the guided tours that Alexandros is proposing in December and January. And you will also have also the possibility to, if you're in Luxembourg, we organize also guided tours in Luxembourg. So hope to see you soon. Take care. And I have to close the session now. First of all, I will stop the recording.